This is another in a series of short videos, and this one is going to be about the contrasting learning experience. So what am I going to try to talk about today? When the CLE takes place, what might it involve? I'm kind of bounce back and forth around that theme a little bit. Who is involved? Key people, and some notes on best practice. So let's have a go. Excuse me. When does it take place? Usually from January to June. In the first year of the postgraduate DIP route, and in the second year for the BA route. Earlier start time for part-time staff. Usually part-time staff for the apprenticeship program is around about 30 hours per week. So obviously, if you're working a shorter week, you're going to need a longer period of time to complete the necessary 70 days, which I'll come back to too. There are, of course, professional standards that govern assessment and activities. And for our purposes, we start off with the PCF, BASWell PCF, level of end of first placement. There's a little link there, but you can find that on the BASWell site, and it gives you details under the 9 domains. So the PCF covers the whole of the CLE, which usually is going to be December, January to June. The social work apprenticeship standards, Skills England, social work apprenticeship standards are relevant throughout, as they are for the whole course. And again, you can find more details about those via that link. There's also a short video about professional standards on the course, give you a little bit more detail about those things, and you can have a little look at that. But really, the most important thing, I suppose, in many ways, is an increased focus of strength and depth of evidence. So things like the index of evidence become very important. And of course, we're looking for progression and development over the life of the course. The CLE is a very important stage in that process. So just a little bit of kind of further detail, that we should really be led by the apprentice, learning needs, and perhaps preferences. But a note of caution, the employer is the person who has the final word as to where that placement will be, and indeed, in some respects at least, how that will be organised. And even though we strongly recommend that the apprentice, mentor, employer rep have a discussion about what will be most suitable for the apprentice's learning and development, there are limits to what a person can expect from placements, because the real world tells us that some teams, for example, might not have the capacity to take on a student or a learner at any given time. Lots of factors might be involved in that. It might simply be staffing and resources. So while you may express a preference, you might not always get that. And so we have to be realistic about what might be achieved. It must be contrasting. The guidelines that are set down by Social Work England about placements and social work education, they're pretty clear. And there's 3 broad ways that you might get contrast. So within a particular service means if you were, for example, in an adults team and you're in a locality or a community-based team of some description, then you might go to a hospital discharge team, or perhaps a mental health team, depending on how services are constellated in your local authority. So something that's sufficiently contrasting from your normal day-to-day job, as it were. You might have a situation where you're within a local authority, but you move to another service area. So, for example, from adults to children or vice versa. In this case, the type of team, we're not looking for internal contrast. We have contrast over a whole different area of service delivery. People do that quite frequently. Be a little bit cautious. It's quite a challenge. Usually for apprentices, we find this a really valuable thing. They get an insight and understanding to other areas of their local authority that they may have very little engagement with, but nonetheless, they're quite often linked in various different ways, usually chronologically or over time. So, for example, a young person may make a transition from children and family services to adult services. So in this instance, again, our caution would be that, how would I say, that apprentices are often seen as a safe pair of hands and they may be overwhelmed with too much work because they're seen as competent and capable. Another version might be that people go too slow in their kind of offer of work for what the apprentice might do. But in any event, the general principle here is that you're going from one area of service delivery to a very different area of service delivery, but within the same organization. The third option, which happens less frequently, but certainly happens, is where a person has a placement in an entirely different organization. So we would have a number of third sector partners, voluntary charitable organizations, and so on. And they may need, and in fact are likely to benefit in a in a really kind of significant way, I suppose is what I'm trying to say, from an experience of statutory services. Now, the boundaries between statutory and the voluntary sector are a little bit porous. They're not kind of as clear cut as it might appear at first glance, but certainly it's a very different experience if you're working in the voluntary sector and then you have that statutory experience. I suppose it is possible that we would do it the other way around, but that does not tend to happen in the apprenticeship program to date. Not to say it might not happen in the future, but again, all of these things are to be negotiated, bearing in mind the availability and just the pragmatic arrangements that might need to be in place, and of course, the apprentice's learning needs and preferences. So it must be 70 days. The requirement for social work education is that there's 200 days over the life of any given course in practice education. And they're usually divided into 70 days, 100 days, and 30 days skills training, which usually happens in the university. So this is the first placement, 70 days, must complete all the days. There's a day tracker, a document that keeps an account of these. It has to be signed off by the apprentice and on-site supervisor, usually, or sometimes the mentor. The recommended caseload or workload is about 20 to 25% of what that team would normally expect from an individual practitioner. Now, this is a negotiated amount, if you will, between the employers and the university. So it has been kind of discussed endlessly, and this is the agreement that we have come up with. And there is a contractual agreement in the apprenticeship program between employers and the university. So this is something that will cover all apprenticeship CLEs, regardless of where they are. There is reflection time built in. Of course, there's supervision expectations built in. We won't actually talk about that much today, but obviously apprentices need reflective supervision, which might be delivered in a number of ways and might be divided between different people. So the mentor, the on-site supervisor, and perhaps the line manager may be involved in that supervision, and group learning on the part of the apprentices where other learners gathered together in reflective groups can also count for that. Supervision is not just one-to-one, and it might be done in many different ways. The reflective time, what we recommend, or we state that the apprentice should have, is a half hour a day. Now, that might be constellated, as it were, in a number of different ways. You might do the half hour a day, and that might suit some people better, or a lot of people kind of put those 4 half hours together and do 2 hours in any given week. That way, I suppose you have a little bit longer, but you might do a little bit more in-depth work. But the typical things that are used, that are done rather in that time, are reflective journals, perhaps maintaining the index of evidence, perhaps doing some assignment activities or things relating to the CLE agreement. So it's purposeful time, and it's okay to ask what a person has been doing with that time. But it is valued by apprentices, and perhaps in particular is a way of articulating that reflection that is happening. So you need a bit of space and time to do that. There is a direct observation of practice. That has to be a direct observation of competent practice. during the CLE, which will usually be facilitated by the on-site supervisor or mentor, or it might be done by a third party if everybody is agreed. So there might be a practice educator in the team, for example, who's very skilled at direct observation, and that will be fine. There is a short video about direct observations, the process, etc., etc. You can refer to that. There is a Viva or a Viva in April 2026, and again, there's another video about that. Vivas are short verbal presentations about a theme of some description. In this instance, it's a kind of a reflective take on casework that the person has done on the CLE. As I say, lots more detail about that, but the presentations are recorded and uploaded onto Canvas, our virtual learning environment. More information to follow, and there is final portfolio submission, and again, we'll give you some advice about how to put that final portfolio together and who has to do what, and that is going to be in June. Recording this in 2025, so the portfolio will be submitted June 2026, but it'll always be June, regardless of what year you're watching this. So who are involved? Obviously, the apprentice is core to the whole thing. As an adult learner, should be kind of, I suppose, quite assertive about their learning needs and how you might achieve those. The sub-regional assessor is a university member of staff, usually a practice educator, in fact, invariably a practice educator, quite often a practice assessor, usually a very experienced member of staff, and somebody who also is likely to have teaching responsibilities of some description at the university. The mentor, well, we know for sure that apprentices value consistency in their mentoring arrangements over time. So quite often people might have the same mentor throughout the whole course. But of course, life continues to life. And it may be that that's just simply not possible. People move on, they change jobs and they change roles and so on. But the options are that you may maintain the same mentor, but you're likely to need an on-site supervisor in the actual CLE, somebody who is very familiar with the work of that particular team or placement, whatever it might be, usually an experienced member of staff. And there's a little bit of negotiation to be done here because you may have the mentor, the on-site supervisor, and the apprentice working out who is going to do what, in particular, who is going to complete some documents and who is going to provide supervision, guidance, and ongoing and informal support as well. So adult learners can negotiate these things. People with lived experience are always involved in social work education, very typically through the direct observation, where you might get some direct feedback, but you'll also want some further feedback from another person that you have been working with as an apprentice. And there are various different ways that you might achieve that or kind of get that feedback. But again, we ask for 2 forms of feedback by the end of the placement. So that's roughly who's involved. And of course, we will need an agreement, contrasting learning agreement or mentoring agreement, to kind of outline the parameters and expectations of the CLE. So obviously the first thing is about learning opportunities, but prior to that, there is a section about getting to know each other. We would advise that, in particular, where there's a new learning relationship between the apprentice and the on-site supervisor, spend a little bit of time getting to know each other. And we have talked about that in the first year of study or the first term of study of your postgraduate DIP. There are ways to do that. And again, there is some guidance available about that. So the learning opportunity should be quite detailed, include things about not only what the learning opportunity is, but also what is expected to be learned from that opportunity. Later on, the index of evidence will kind of translate that experience into what actually happened, if you see what I mean. So it's worthwhile spending time developing the learning opportunities and kind of maximizing really what kind of opportunities there might be on the placement. You need to pay attention to how the apprentice will be supported to meet their learning needs. There's pragmatic things, first of all. You might have to take caring responsibilities into account, start and end times, all of those kind of things. Um, are there physical barriers for the apprentice? We have to think about travel, accessibility, things of that nature. But also, are there particular learning needs for that apprentice that need to be taken into account? Are there things that they learned, for example, in the first year or the first term of study, that have come to light that we need to kind of ensure, sometimes in terms of reasonable adjustments, or sometimes kind of a bit broader things about how the apprentices might best learn, things of that nature. So you think about what support does this particular apprentice require, and of course, we will be talking about supervision within that. So the expectations of everyone involved are laid out in a fair level of detail in the actual template at the start of the document. Worthwhile going through that a little bit and making sure everybody's clear about all the roles and responsibilities. But of course, this is a negotiation, and the conversation makes these things real, if you see what I mean. The timing of completing this document, preferably before the placement begins, but that is not always practically possible. But if it's not done beforehand, should really be completed in the first week. So there is a fairly decent length of time to prepare for the CLE. Lots of kind of moving parts have to be discussed and so on and so forth. And part of that preparation should be at least having an initial go at this contract, being familiar with it and what is required. You might have updates. You might have to usually it is you do the initial contract, you review around the midpoint, around 35 days into the placement, and then there's a final review. So this would not be in the least bit surprising to anybody, but on occasion circumstances intervene and you might need to change things. Uh, Learning opportunities may no longer exist, and on occasion, it doesn't happen very often, but the placement might be shown to be non-viable, which means that there are not sufficient learning opportunities within that particular context to demonstrate competence at this particular level. Doesn't happen often, but it does sometimes. So learning opportunities individually might kind of need to be reviewed and changed, but a more kind of fundamental changes when a member of staff leaves. And in those instances, a little bit of renegotiation, etc., etc. If there's a gap between finding a new mentor or on-site supervisor, we'll have to think about, well, what is plan B going to look like? So it's not sufficient in those circumstances to wait for the review, which might be some weeks away. We need to have an interim plan, and we need to have something pretty quick. Placement dates may change. Again, there's negotiation about that. And sometimes placements need to be extended for various different reasons, all of which are likely to be valid. I've said throughout here, there's a review process. But particularly at the midpoint review, we should really be thinking about what new learning opportunities have emerged. So we understand the placement a little bit better and are conscious that there are things that we didn't think about at the start that are now kind of emerging. And it may be that the apprentice has learned something about themselves that they kind of think, oh, I'd like a little bit more development, I'd like a little bit more focus on that. So the midpoint review in particular is very useful for that. There is, as ever, a CLE agreement and template. We've had some discussions about should we send that out. Really, we prefer if the apprentice will bring that template, because the templates actually change year on year. There's a danger that we kind of lose version control, and a person might be using an older template, which are not taking kind of newer developments into account. So that's a little bit kind of worrying. Sometimes the changes are relatively small. Sometimes they might be more fundamental and important. So there's ongoing debate about this. We probably will send out the template this year, but it's not a kind of done deal. So the ideal situation, really, not to put too fine a point on it, is if the apprentice is in control of or responsible for that document. Um, that one document, by the way, we don't need separate reviews. That same one document contains all the reviews, so you don't have to kind of start it all over again. So generally, it's going to work best if the apprentice is responsible for bringing that document to the relevant people. Now, you will get this or a version of this. This particular one is module at a glance for the BA route. The module at a glance for the postgraduate DIP route is very, very similar, and it will just outline dates, expectations when things are due. Now, some of these, there's a little bit of flexibility. If the initial agreement isn't done within the required timeframe, it's not the end of the world. It will cause problems, though. So we give dates that are kind of suggested or target dates. What is not negotiable is the final summary. That's a very different thing. When we're submitting assessed work, if there needs to be changes in that, that has to be taken quite seriously because the university, of course, has lots of regulations and rules about submission of work and the timeliness of that. But this is, roughly speaking, the outline of the timetable. I'm not going to go through it. Suffice it to say that this will be sent out to everybody and hopefully will be helpful in planning the actual placement. Just a few things to keep in mind. I've kind of mentioned some of these already, but nonetheless, repetition is good. First thing is apprentices are learners. So apprentices are kind of unique in that they are both learners and experienced members of staff. So they already know a lot of stuff, right? But they're still learners. So we must bear that kind of primary identity, in a sense, in mind. They need time and space to learn and develop. And I think what we found over the years is where employers, and in the main, this is the case, where employers allow for that and take care of their apprentices, apprentices are more likely to stay with you. And after all, this is a kind of a grow your own program. So it would be kind of important to leave that space there, even though at times that might be challenging for employers in terms of workloads and the endless stream of work coming in the front door. But they're more likely to succeed in the course and perhaps to stay with employers if we allow that time and space. It's a strengths-based approach always on the program. We start always with what people can do, and then we work on areas for development. It's a very simple principle. If you start from a solid and positive basis, it's easier to build than if you start from a deficit model and start pointing out what the apprentice cannot do. So how we do feedback, then it turns out is just as important as the content of feedback. We all need to grow, learn, develop. I am no different. You are no different in this regard, but I'm more likely to be motivated to make changes if the feedback is given in such a way that I can receive it. I hope that's fairly straightforward. I have said several times here that there's a 20 to 25% of usual caseload or workload. I noticed a little typo there. Please forgive. So really, this means we don't overwhelm people with tasks beyond their competence or workload that doesn't allow for development of competence. So negotiating pace and timing are important. Obviously, overwhelm, too much work, etc., which would typically happen as, this apprentice is going to that team, and that apprentice is coming to my team. I'll just give them the apprentice who's leaving. I'll just give them their caseload. That is not going to work. That is going to overwhelm and in fact disempower the apprentice. So just kind of watch out for kind of dynamics of that nature. So the overwhelm is one thing. Underwhelm is also another, because you're trying to find a sweet spot where you're kind of pushing the envelope. It's constructive educational approach, what we call it. And you're trying to kind of move out of the zone of comfort and avoiding the zone of panic, basically. So, apprentices know a fair few things. They may actually progress or be ready for more work than many other learners who do not have experience of services. So let's avoid boring them also. They need to be given responsibility and significant opportunities to develop. And again, this happens in the negotiation, finding that sweet spot between too much and too little. So seek advice from the SRA or other core staff as required. Again, it's relationship-based practice is what we know works in social work, and that's also what works in social work education. So let's keep the conversation going. Final little note or two. The submission of the portfolio will always be in June, and this is pretty much the content of that. I think it's fairly straightforward, really. There's the CLE agreement and reviews, the direct observation, which I've mentioned earlier, two feedbacks, so one which will usually be generated by the direct observation, but not always, and one AN other, always gathered by the observer or the mentor or the on-site supervisor, not the apprentice. There's always going to be a separation between the actual worker and the person who gathers the feedback. It kind of guarantees that perhaps, or at least it helps to guarantee that the PLE can speak freely. That's the general idea there. There's a critical reflection and practice of 1,500 words that goes into the portfolio. Bear in mind there has been an earlier Viva. This also contributes to the overall assessment. And there is an index of evidence. Now we're expecting a pretty robust and detailed index of evidence on the CLE, referring back to my kind of initial point, that's the strength and depth of evidence. We're expecting to see a step up here really in that, and it's highly advisable. In fact, it's kind of essential really that the apprentice starts to maintain that at the earliest possible opportunity. And that might actually be before the placement starts, because you might be reading up about the practice area, policy, procedure, legislation prior to actually starting the placement. So that in itself would be appropriate to include in the index of evidence, as well as all the things that happen over the 70 days. We're looking for one feedback from an associated professional, I suppose is the best way to put it, somebody who was not the SRA line manager or mentor. So somebody that the apprentice has an opportunity to work with um, on the CLE. We find in actual fact this is not difficult to get. People are very generous with their time and effort and sometimes provide very detailed feedback, which is again very useful. And at the end, we have an assessment by the SRA, because the overall assessment, that's the SRA's responsibility. Completing the documents, completing the reviews, usually is going to happen between the mentor or on-site supervisor and the apprentice, but there will be input from the SRA and in particular guidance about what a good level of feedback and assessment in those documents looks like, but with the overall assessment at the end of the CLE done by the SRA. So questions, well, Marva, you can see her address here, is the module leader for both routes. That's the postgraduate and the BA route, SW5013, SW5014, if you like to have the module kind of descriptor, as it were. She has provided her telephone number there. I am the second person listed here as Dermot Brady. That's my ESCO address. Well, we don't need the ESCO anymore, but it'll still get through to me. It don't matter. And there's my telephone number. So if you need to get in contact with us, please do. We learn from the questions that people ask. Basically, there's a principle here. If you're closer to the learning, as the mentor, the on-site supervisor, and the apprentice will be, you are more likely to see things that us university staff who are a little bit further away from it will not. So those questions that you ask are always very important. And again, it is a collaborative effort. So it's collaborative effort with concentric circles and rings of collaboration and communication, if you see what I mean. So really, that's it for this presentation. Thank you very much for your time and listening to this, and bye.